Have you heard there's a big holiday coming up? I cannot wait for Saturday.
Yeah. Wait, Saturday?
Yes, International Oyster Day.
Yes.
Yes.
And we had some yesterday. Well, let's just say we go ahead and hop in a time machine and go dredging through the past. I mean, with Jim Duffy of Secrets of the Eastern Shore.
Yes. Good
Dredging
afternoon.
through the past. I
So
love
to have
it.
you here. So we're Blue Point Oyster. Is that what you're talking? What's
Blue Point
what is?
Oyster.
Isn't that a New York thing?
I don't.
Blue
It
Point
is.
Oyster.
It is a New York thing.
Okay.
Oh.
Blue Point Oysters, it's the most famous brand in oyster history, with all due respect to the people in Chincoteague who also have a very famous brand. But
Okay.
goes back to the 1820s, 1830s. We're on Long Island, a place called Great South Bay, and there's a little town there called Blue Point.
Okay.
It's kind of near Fire Island on the way to Montauk, that kind of thing. Blue Point supposedly got its name because a blue haze sits over the land right at the edge of the bay, which is appropriate because it's a little hazy. The history here is a little bit hazy.
All goes hand in hand.
And I should say that I run the risk when we decide to do this story of looking like kind of a small and venal person. You know the 7 deadly sins and how one of them is pride. Yeah, I think we're
I'd be
gonna-
one of them.
I think that's where we're going here today.
Okay.
Okay.
So, 1812. A guy named Joseph Avery is living in Blue Point. Starts to build a house. Has to go off and serve in the military. Comes back, finishes the house. 1820. He's a fisherman. So he goes out fishing in the spring, in the summer, in the fall, a little clamming. There aren't any oysters near him very much. So in the wintertime, he needs to make a little extra money. So what he does in the wintertime is he sails down the ocean. Maybe he goes to Chincoteague, maybe he goes to Oyster, Willis Wharf, something like that. Maybe he comes around and comes up to Crisfield, but he comes to our neck of the woods in the Delmarva Peninsula. Loads up with oysters. Brings them back to New York City, where oysters are gigantic. There's like street vendors on the corners selling oysters. There's little oyster cellars, these dank, dark places where drunks and fights and all this kind of stuff. And I should mention there's one really fancy oyster place where like women and high society people go, and that was the Thomas Downing's Oyster House. Folks might remember a couple of
Yeah, I
years
remember
ago,
that.
we did a thing about the Thomas Downing Oyster House because he was a black guy from Chincoteague, Virginia, who became the king of New York
Right.
oyster
yeah,
market.
yeah.
But anyway, that's an aside. So he does this for a few years. And while he's down on Delmarva, loading up with oysters, he kind of gets to know some watermen and he gets to know what they do. And one of the things that they do is they will scoop up baby oysters and they will put baby oysters in a place where there should be an oyster bar, but there's not. And then those oysters will grow. So he's coming down year after year and he's learning these little strategies of the locals. And one year he takes the plunge, he loads up not with oysters for the New York market, but with baby oysters, and he plants them in the Great South Bay right near his home.
Oh.
And voila,
Voila.
the Blue Point oyster is born. And it became, there's all this talk about its robust, wild flavor and everything like that. And it became the most famous brand like almost overnight. It made it all the way over to Europe, where Queen Victoria famously pronounced the Blue Point oyster the greatest oyster in the world.
Really?
And the Blue Point name over the course of many decades became this gigantic thing. Everybody tried to steal the Blue Point name. People in Rhode Island and Connecticut, they started calling their oysters Blue Point. The state of New York had to pass a law like with champagne in France, where it's like you can't use the Blue Point name unless it's from the Great South Bay. And it all kind of came down because of the usual things. Population increased and pollution increased, and a couple of hurricanes rolled through, and there was some over-harvesting. So by the 1930s, 1940s, the Blue Point oyster had kind of died out. The name still lives. There's still people calling things Blue Point oysters, but they're not really connected with it. There's one guy who's working in the Great South Bay who's doing it. And anyway, we took this little diversion to New York today because my deadly sin of pride. I take great pride in learning that the folks up in New York who like write big articles, look at us, we're the Blue Point oyster place, and they put up historic markers and they do all this stuff. And when you dig into it a little bit, it was just like a guy from up there came down here, learned from our watermen Bear. Yes. I love that as a history
really
nerd. I love when that happens. And it makes me look like a small venal person, doesn't it?
No,
Okay.
not at all. Not at all. And with Thanksgiving a week away, we got to ask you, what are you thankful for this year?
I am thankful for the time that I get to spend here on Thursdays, not just with you, but because, you know, there's a little waiting out there.
Right.
And every week I get to meet more and more incredible, like people, all shapes, sizes, colors, sexes, everything else. And they're all just trying to make this a better place. And I'm grateful for them.
You're a good
And for
man.
the way you spotlight them, too.
You are a good man.
You are. We're grateful for you. Thank you so much, Jim Duffy, Secrets of the Eastern Shore. We'll be right back.